Last time, we left off with an Ethernet port, 1998, Crestron CN-MSX Pro, a control processor that shipped with a network connection before anyone, including the people who built it, fully knew what they were going to do with it. What that port opened up changed the industry permanently. It didn't just change how you connected to a control system, it changed who could build them, who could sell them, who could compete. It changed what a programmer's job even was. This is part 2, the state of control, the digital age.
So I remember very, very distinctly when we started getting these units in. Again, prior to this unit, we always used to laugh. I think the running joke was, you know, if you were going to remote access, you had to call through the fax line, right? So there was the modem update, and so this is what we go back to the old days of the and you know, that was when we were actually starting out before the internet. We would actually use the fax line or the home line to call into the system with a modem, and then the modem would actually connect to the processor. And so to actually be able to use the internet at this point and not have to worry about running around, you know, the facility going, don't pick up the phone, don't pick up the phone. It was a brand new way of operating for us. The one thing, though, that we all noticed was that it didn't just automatically turn on when it first arrived. So I think we spent our first few days just trying to figure out how to get the unit to talk onto a network. And then once we started figuring that out, but it opened up a whole new range of options. I mean, just the speed to be able to update things. That was one of the things that I was pretty happy about. And, you know, there weren't a whole lot of options. I mean, there were no IP controlled devices at that point. I mean, it was literally, we were using it mostly for connectivity at that point. Everything else that we had was a legacy device. But yeah, I was exactly half that age. I was 28 years old when that unit. So a half of my lifetime ago, that unit came out.
I remember too the term e-control. That was something that Crestron coined, and I don't think that anybody quite understood what that really meant. And it was, we were all kind of looking at each other and, you know, following their lead. You know, one of the first things that we did also was upload web pages. So you were able to take your interface design and convert it into a web page. And at least you had something that you could access your system if a touch panel wasn't available or if you needed to control it remotely. That was a big thing. You can actually sit in another room. You could have a tech controlling a system without being in front of the touch panel because they could call up the web page. So that was actually, you know, a big thing with the Ethernet port. And I also agree that we really were using it just to upload. We weren't using it to control anything. It was that was just foreign. You know, and there were other devices that may have an Ethernet port, but a lot of them were for service only. So it wasn't something that was that was commonplace. In fact, it's only recently that everything is on the network and everything is being controlled over IP. It's you know, the control side of the Ethernet port really took a long time to mature.
Yeah, and you know, at that point too, for outside access, we were learning things like, well, I mean, if I think back to the days of our sense of network security, you know, I mean, it was network security for us was basically handling a toddler, an espresso, and a puppy and seeing what happens. I mean, I look back to the things that we did with these systems to make them accessible, you know, that you think about now and go, you know, yeah, we shouldn't have been allowed to do that, you know. And then there was the point where once those devices started popping up, you know, of course, invariably, people started poking around in systems. And I remember, you know, it might have been the generation after, but we started having processors getting shut down because they were being pinged by PCs from all over the world. They were just kind of randomly going out there and hitting units. And we all kind of went, oh, maybe we ought to do something about that.
Another thing I can remember, a similar story, that we would upload web pages, but if you were in a school or someplace where the students knew that they could poke around, you really had to protect things. So you'd have to put a password on it, but really the amount of security was not something that was protecting you. It was just a little bit of a deterrent.
By adding a network ability onto a control processor, it really opened up an entire world of possibility in what we can do. One of the first things we did, we made eControl, which now allowed you to control your system from a web page, either locally or anywhere in the world. And that really changed the way you could offer support services. You now could have managed services remote away from the site of where the install was. And it really opened up the opportunity not only to us, but also to our integrators for what they could do and what they could make these systems do. The other thing is it opened up the door to now have that control system. Instead of being this isolated box just controlling this space, it can now talk to other systems. So it really opened up the world of possibility of what we could do ourselves, but really what our customers and integrators could now do with these systems.
As the network became more and more useful to the AV vendors, it still was never really, and I don't even know that today it's really accepted by the networking people themselves. They don't like our stuff on their network. They don't like anything on their network, quite frankly. They're not too happy with that. So that's just kind of how it evolved, and now we are much more network centric than we've ever been. Most of my career in doing this has been in the government and Department of Defense. So the ability for them to accept anything on their network has been isolated. So that has kept me from having to deal with most customers' networks, because anytime we did have a customer that had stuff on their network, usually when there was a control system problem, it's because they changed and updated their Cisco switch.
With network connectivity came scale, and with scale came something that happens to every small, tight-knit industry. When it suddenly becomes visible to the rest of the world, everybody wants a piece of it. And that includes the company that started the network control. Crestron CEO Dan Feldstein tells us what it was like in the market once they introduced control to the network.
So, Steve, I think after the years, we started coming up with lots of different sayings along the way. I think one of these became, people have called it an Uncle Richieism. But with the ability for outside access, or even just the ability to be on a different floor, in a central location, where you didn't have to be, sitting on a paint can next to a processor under a credenza, with a 15-foot serial cable. You had the ability to, deploy sometimes at scale or deploy to other areas. But it brought up one problem. You couldn't see what you were doing. And that's when we started running into some new challenges, which was, we used to call it the ready, fire, aim method. We just push it out. Oh, it'll be fine. No problem at all. And then you walk downstairs, you go into the conference room from where you were in the MDF, and you take a look and you see, oh, wow, the screen dropped, or this, that, or that, other things have happened. I admit that I had dropped a motorized screen right on top of a piece of furniture because I was absolutely sure I had it dialed. And this was in Resi. And sure enough, not one of my prouder moments, I destroyed a screen because I just was so happy with how fast this was. Then we get into the items of firmware. Firmware was always interesting, and you're old enough to remember along with me that we used to always have what we would call Firmware Tuesdays. There was always an update, and if there was going to be an update, it was on a Tuesday. But we also learned something in the field, which was how to stop creating issues for yourself. And so, over the years, it came down to one simple phrase when it was doing updates, which was, we called it nothing new after 2. That was kind of your rollback point. Anything after that, you were potentially going to be eating cold pizza in a conference room at 11 o'clock at night. with the other one, which was, especially on a Friday, right? Anybody who popularized firmware Friday, that was the first thing you tell them is that, you are gambling right there. But yeah, no, our nothing new after 2 was definitely the one that we lived by.
Yeah, some of the stories that I can remember too, it was one thing when you had a serial cable, like you mentioned, and you were connecting right to the device, but it's another thing when you had to change the settings in your computer to get on the same network, or you had to register your device with IT and wait till they gave you an IP address. And that was a whole process, and it always took forever. And then if you put your device on the network without going through and getting permission, all of a sudden the authorities would come in, and I mean that lightly in terms of the IT folks from wherever you were working. They would hunt you down and figure out, who's the one that put the device and why is that thing on my network. That was a big issue too, is that we came all of a sudden with our black boxes and said, hey, can we put this on your network? And we need an IP address, and that to be able to get something approved to go on the network too was an ordeal. I remember that vividly. So it really wasn't a smooth transition when we first started doing this by any stretch.
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, there was a whole lot of time where we jump in with a static IP and just kind of went for it. And next thing you know, that's exactly it. People start running down going, away we go.
When the pie was small, it didn't attract that many other people. But when the pie gets big, everybody wants a piece of it. And that's certainly been a challenge for us to continue to grow and innovate.
Different manufacturers starting to get into what other manufacturers did. When both AMX and Crestron were only doing control systems, everybody got along with AMX and Crestron. In fact, the funny thing was, during that time period, I still had contacts when I was working at AMX. I still had contacts at Crestron. Crestron had contacts at AMX. And we were frequently talking to each other about different things. Normally not about our own business and how our own devices work, but hey, how did you work with XYZ's company thing that did this? But as the control manufacturers got into developing, marketing, selling switchers, that was the first thing. That's where the divisions started to happen.
Everybody started doing the same thing everybody else did. So everyone was competing for everyone else's market, and they become very just very, I think, watered down, because when you start to forget what your priority is and what got you to the dance, that starts going to the wayside with reliability when you start focusing on other things that were not your specialty.
One of the challenges when you have a open control system that can do anything is that isn't always a good thing. So we saw very early on that it was important to be able to make sure that people who we were giving this incredibly powerful tool to, that they were properly trained and knew how to develop systems the right way, not only to save our reputation, but also to make sure the end customers were getting the experience that they really wanted. And so we started to offer a lot of training. And then we could quickly see, well, some people were trained, some people weren't. And we wanted to help differentiate out in the world, do you have the right person to program your system? Because anybody at that time could say, yeah, I can program a Crestron system. So by creating the certified programmer levels, it allowed us to be able to communicate to whether it was an integrator who didn't have their own in-house programming or an end user looking to hire somebody, what to ask for, what to look for to make sure that you were going to have a programmer that not only could say they could make the system do what you wanted, but they had been through the training, they were certified, and they were going to do the best possible job to make that system work the way you needed it to work.
More manufacturers and a bigger market also meant a new question that the industry still hasn't fully answered. Does every installation need a highly skilled custom programmer? Or can you give a less specialized person a configurator and get the room working just the same?
Well, I think this is where we started getting our clear definition sometimes between marketing and execution. I've got to say now, you know what, we're now 25 years into. About every other year, I see a tagline for somebody with no programming required. And everybody goes nuts and they tell everybody, you know, and then you've got everybody who's a systems programmer going, oh my gosh, they're trying to get rid of us. This is, you know, and you've got everybody on the manufacturing side saying, oh, you know, our biggest problem is the programmers. And it was this constant back and forth in that I think that we were all still learning how to work with one another, how to specialize. Because again, as a manufacturer, you know, we've said this so many times, typically the only time you got the call in was when somebody was complaining to you. You never really got the, hey, you guys are doing great, thumbs up. And it wears on you. So, you know, and as the manufacturers were going, the whole goal was like, well, how can we get more market share? How can we get into the base? If there is a fixed amount of programmers, we need to find a way to get to scale, because what happens when we get a law office or we get a Fortune 500 company and they don't have 5 conference rooms or classrooms, they've got 500. How can you physically get this out there in a reasonable amount of time where each project doesn't take you a year? Just by the time you start with the first site and you get to the last one, the cycle's completed, that you have to go back to the first one and start all over again with the new generation. I mean, that was an actual thing that was occurring. Like the deployment cycles were things that need to be factored in. And that's when the questions started coming. And I think, you know, that was the whole concept of framework. Because again, the industry was growing up as well. And we had said it so many times, is that in the early years of AV, they were a good decade, at least a decade behind the software community. And so there was still a whole lot of versions of how it should work versus dealing with the new technology coming through. And I think that became the first big question, which, you know, enterprise was never really my thing, but, you know, corporate customers were saying, hey, how are we going to get this out faster?
Both Crestron and AMX were the ones that were going head to head for a long time in the beginning, and you know, one of the arguments was, do you want to code with line code or do you want to use the symbols? And that was a big debate, and it's very similar to the fact now that, do you want to program or do you want to configure? It's really close to being a similar type of an argument. But if you look at what it is to date right now, there's a lot of parallels to web development and other places where there's the low code and the no code and the full code options. And us as programmers, as you mentioned, we didn't like it one bit, because we always were asked, are you going to be needed? Are you going to have a job? You know, they're putting you out of business. And what we found, and we talked about this a lot on A State of Control, is that programming is only a small part of what programmers do. It's the knowledge that we have, the troubleshooting, and all the other parts that are what programmers bring to the table.
And once everyone started making competing products, it was a challenge deciding which products fit the client's need. Mike Leitenstorfer explains how some made those decisions.
The problem is you can't take the human element out of the programming because of what I said earlier, the personalities of the equipment. None of this stuff is made to work together. So there's a bit of an art involved in this, and that's where the programmer comes in. It's a little bit of a black art, is to understand how to manipulate, and I mean manipulate signals, manipulate timing, manipulate strings, manipulate all kinds of stuff to get your desired effect. Anything in life that is a universal fit is usually got some type of compromise. Nothing is a universal this, universal that. It's always a compromise by the time you get it done. And so when you do a universal software package that's going to configure everything for you, it's going to be magic. I'm somewhat skeptical.
There are very few systems that don't have some level of control. Now, a lot of control is somewhat locked down. It's very, very specific to a specific application. In some cases, it's slightly configurable, but it's not fully programmed. There is always control. It's just a question of how much can you modify that to what you want it to do. And I think that's where we're at now, where as we now see the need for technology in nearly every type of space, certainly in a business, you see that the scope and scale of these projects have gotten so large that we can't make every single space an experiment where we're custom programming everything. So we see the need for these more standardized control platforms that do a very specific task, or something that's configurable to certain aspects of that space without being fully programmed, fully customized. But so I think we see that kind of balance where a lot of when we talk about the control on the market, it's more that application specific control. We, of course, have done that as well. We feel it's very important to continue to always provide that ability to do that fully wide open, customizable, program anything you want type system. And that's really part of who we are at our core. So that's something we're not going to get rid of. But we will continue to look for ways where we can make those deployments at scale simpler, easier, more repeatable.
So here's a funny thing about an industry that was founded on the idea of making rooms easier to use. It got complicated. Really, genuinely, sometimes almost comically complicated. And the people who spent the most time programming those systems will be the first to tell you. Now, more features don't mean better systems. Sometimes they just mean more ways to confuse a teacher on a Monday morning.
I can't tell you how many times we were asked to include things just in case. And
oh yeah,
and how many features and how many buttons did you put in the background that they might need later on. And there were times where I almost thought that we'd be better off just still having the remotes. We were trying to put too much into these systems, but it's the just in case stuff. And a lot of times it was making sure that somebody was, covering their job. They were making sure that they weren't going to be the ones that were going to have the fingers pointed at them because something was left out. And a lot of times too, programmers would be given, drawings, and if they're lucky, getting drawings, and they would have to program a system based on what they thought it should do. And you put a lot of flexibility and functionality because we didn't actually know what the user wanted. So there was so much that a system could do, but that didn't necessarily mean that's what it should do.
Well, and again, this was pre-web pages, pre-web developer, kind of canned user interface rules, right? There weren't graphic designers on staff. I mean, I think, gosh, what was this? In I think 2000, we kind of made a big point of it, and that we hired a graphic designer specifically for UI development. We brought in someone with a background in that, because prior to that, again, you don't necessarily leave the person coding to also do the user interface. You always have the running line is you never let them touch the touch panel, because they already knew where the landmines were, and they would just coincidentally skip over during the testing process the parts that they knew that they were going to break along the way. Things like third-party QC. And then, great, you think you have it, you get the scope, you talk to who you think are the decision makers, and then next thing you know, somebody walks into the room and you're now redesigning by committee. Scope creep. That's when, and again, really with the user interface, that's when scope creep really started to happen. That's when you started, could you just, right? In our running line, when we ever heard the word just, was just because you could doesn't mean you should. And that became a matter of, is it a need versus a want? Is this functional? And we even started hedging away from using the word simple, because simple was just a mixed bag. It could mean so many different things. We kind of settled on the word elegant because we wanted to create an experience in it, which is, because people would tell you and just go, I just want a simple system. I just want a simple system. Well, simple how? It's not clairvoyant. So now we need to start creating, the definitions of how are we going to deliver. And that's where things are complicated, because we still didn't have the experience of all of the mistakes that we made, because we were making them for the first time. To look back at and go, that was tried before, and this didn't really work out, and let me explain why. And at the time, again, we're still, a lot of us were still rock and roll. This was like, let's just get it done, and, the running joke used to be like when we brought in new programmers, we would have some who wouldn't come in because they were like, well, it's time for lunch. I'm like, lunch? What are you talking about? You'll eat when you're done. There was just and again, looking back now in terms of overall wellness, not the best approach. But at that point, it's when you were kind of the coder or the programmer, they pointed over and they said, that's the programmer, that was part of their charm, good, bad, or indifferent.
George Feldstein built Crestron from a drafting table to a global company and was one of the defining forces in this industry for decades. His son Dan has spoken beautifully about his vision and legacy, but there are things about George Feldstein that you could only know if you worked with him.
I mean, George Feldstein was an interesting individual. First you've got to understand just how amazingly smart and focused he was. He would show up when we were building the showroom, the experience center in New Jersey, in Rockland, New Jersey, which still, I guess, Volvo Way. He would be there at 3 a.m. He would show up randomly. Now, he lived a couple of blocks away, maybe 2 miles, 3 miles away, but he was so focused on what we were doing and so focused on how those things worked. His famous fight with the founder of Extron, in which the founder of Extron did not believe that IP was the way that the world was going, and George Feldstein was adamant that they were going to lose out and that they were going to fail because of it. Those are the stories, especially with George. There's 1,000 other ones I can tell about all kinds of stuff, but he was a remarkable individual. There's both good and bad, but on the whole, I think he was just an amazing creative genius that I'm still astounded by today.
Through all of it, the binary strings, the RS-232 handshakes, the Cisco switch reboots, and the camouflage touch panels, the people who actually built and programmed these systems were doing something that's harder to describe than any job title suggests. Something that lives between engineering and art.
So what we were doing is not only making a system work and making these products that didn't necessarily talk to one another natively work seamlessly and mesh together, but we also had to make the experience for the users something that was appealing and branded and something that everybody that looked at these panels on a touch panel on a table said this was worth what they paid for it. So the programmers had a big weight on their shoulders. It wasn't just the technical side of making everything work.
Yeah, and again, we all came from different backgrounds. There were people who came from a traditional computer science background, but we've talked it several times. I didn't plan on being a programmer. It was not, on my bingo card. I went to film school. And it just so happened that technology was always on the backside, but I was also the sales guy. And so, I've told the story a couple of times, and we've had it on the show, of how I got thrust into programming, and it just kind of became part of our bag of tricks. But it was every person I've talked to, who started at the time that we did, most came and said, yeah, I wouldn't have guessed it. I wouldn't have figured out that this is what I would have wound up doing. And they had an affinity for it, and they were able to lay the groundwork, but I think in large part because they were the most tenacious. We had a lot of people who would come in and try it, but when they saw how to deal with software in the AV industry, that was a completely different process. I remember one time we talked to somebody and, He was a network engineer. He had gone through the Cisco certifications, and they had their own acronyms. You show them a touch panel and how to get a projector screen to rise and drop, and they're like, no, wait, I didn't know that this was going to be, this thing moved. There was a very large gap in between those worlds at the time that they just didn't know how to mix yet. And so as a result, it was still AV guys who were taking their skill set and going, job's got to get done. I guess that's us. And I think that's where the original foundational companies, individuals, people you talk to, came through.
It's like buying paint for a painter. You can buy the paint and it does nothing until a painter makes it into art. So, I'm not saying I'm an artist by any means, but a programmer, you have to have knowledge of technical componentry. You also have to have a bit of an artistic or creative mind to get that to pull off in a seamless fashion. You want to be able to get people to get their functions with as few as presses as possible on a touch panel, for example. And that's really where the experience in the artwork comes into it.
Mike Leitensdorfer has spent 36 years programming systems that were never designed to do what he made them do. And at a military installation in Missouri, he built something that might be the most unexpected application of an AV control system anyone in this industry has ever described.
I automated a shoot house for the federal government, for a military installation here in Missouri. We were at Infocom in Vegas one year, and one of the principals out there was talking to me about the problems that they're having. Everybody's huddled over, the operators are huddled over this little toggle switchboard, and they've got markings on the floor, and they're watching it on surveillance cameras. And when these recruits would come in to learn how to clear a house, they would switch these switches and move the targets. So I sat there on a cocktail napkin, and we drew out how I would automate this entire system. So it was 2 runs of shoot house. So there was a left side and a mirrored right side of 6 rooms. And they said when it took them over about 14 hours to get a whole, I think it was a company. I don't know the proper term for the amount of troops, but for that amount of troops, it took them over about 14 hours to get them through these training on how to clear a house. So I automated this. I put ingress and egress lights over each entry door. And we used Crestron control system. I used lighting controllers to switch the targeting because it was electromechanical. It was electro-pneumatic, actually. So I used the lighting controller trigger to trigger what was then the toggle switches. And then we put in motion sensors so that you would trigger a motion sensor as you crossed a beam that would make the target move automatically. Well, they said, well, these guys talk. So then I had to program all of the delays and different timings of all of the targets so that the guys that came out the end couldn't say, hey, when you go in the second room, 2 guys are going to pop up behind the couch. So the next guys go in, they walk in, nothing pops up immediately. It pops up at a time delay. And then, so that all happened. They came out the backside. In the meantime, the operators were sitting there, and all this was being recorded on USB drives at the time. And when they got done, they'd take it out of the USB drive and they put it into the USB player. And then at the 7th room was their after action review. So they had a Crestron wall plate, and they could immediately play, stop, fast forward, rewind, and show the recruits where you're looking, where you're aiming, what you're doing wrong, what you're doing right. We were getting them out, the entire company, instead of 14 hours, they were done within a half a day by automating this process. It's just using something in a non-standard format, which is kind of what our industry does. We tend to use things the way they weren't designed to be used.
After 50 years of relay closures and binary strings, Ethernet ports and market explosions, camouflage touch panels and military shoot houses, where does everyone who built this industry think it's going? Ask them. The answer is remarkably consistent, and it sounds a lot like where it all started.
Well, that was definitely interesting take. I can't say anything. What does they say? You ain't wrong. I think that the work is kind of coming full circle. I think all of the underlying structures, the people, and the specialization. I think that the biggest part is the work still gets done. It's still the same process. It's not necessarily just a guy or a girl who performs this function now. It is a team. It does require different skill sets. And I think we've gotten closer to the software development field in that respect, in that, you'll have software architects, people who are responsible for the large overview. You'll have project coordinators, project architects, right? Somebody who's responsible for getting the different parts of the Legos to click together. And then you may have somebody who's a specialist in the UI side of things, or HTML, or Java, or Python, or, insert programming language here. And what we've done now is that it is an environment of collaboration, even just resource sharing. With people, as an example, I know you've put out several modules that you released to the community. They're like, hey, there was something that we made that worked, that made our life easier, and we were going to make it anyway. And so it's not really something that we want to manage trying to track payment on. So here you go. Here's a tool. And I love that. I love the spirit of the community still. There is still that rock and roll kind of anarchist role, which is just like everything should be free and open, which conflicts sometimes with the closed and the walled gardens of the manufacturers. But that is the spirit of the community in that sense, right? Know one, grow one, passing on that information, tribal knowledge. We still have it. And the growth of the resources to be able to collaborate and pop up on a Facebook group or a Discord server or, an email list. I remember, the old days, there was the holy grail was getting it to the original Yahoo programmers group, for both manufacturers. And it was literally an email digest that's been going on still for 30 years. The old tool, the old school is the best school sometimes, I think people think.
It was fun when we first started doing this because we were kind of figuring it out as we went along, but it was also challenging in that regard too. And like, we talked about earlier, you had to know the person who had the knowledge, who can answer the question or could figure something out for you. Or sometimes you even had to get a special version of something just to make your project work. And there was a lot of time that we all spent on site, working late hours, frustrated, trying to figure things out. And, in a lot of regards, we've crossed that channel. We've been able to bring ourselves to the next level. And then we hit, some more challenges and programmers were special in the beginning because there were fewer of them and you kind of knew everybody. And then it became, that everybody was considering themselves a programmer. So that in that regard, we had less respect or less less care and stature about us. But the fact right now that we're doing things that are still challenging, but in different ways. So, you mentioned too that we've found programmers that specialize in different parts and different niches, and we chose to do API integration, but there are some people who choose to do, roll out their own framework. Their programming has continued to provide opportunities, but it's required different pivots for certain programmers to be able to differentiate themselves.
I think there's a way to really simplify a lot of what we're doing, but I think the manufacturers are so feature driven in their marketing that they tend to lose focus of the whole point of the control system, again, was for simplicity. It doesn't need to be that difficult. And I think when they figure that out, I think their products are going to be far more reliable, and their things are going to improve drastically, and probably put me out of a job. But at that point, I'm retired anyway.
But we will continue to look for ways where we can make those deployments at scale simpler, easier, more repeatable.
The best control system is the one that no one notices. If you've got a control system that someone has to pay attention to, oh yeah, I've got to go to the XYZ control system to do this. I've got to go to the control system to do that. But if someone says, oh, I just push a button, they don't really even think about whose control system, what control system they're using. It's just the system does this. If it makes the presentation simple, that's where we go from. And that truly is my background. I try to make communication happen. I want to be a facilitator of communication. That's what all these AV systems are about. It's not about who has the best switching, who has the best signal processing, who has the best audio, who has the best control system. It's who can make the system to be transparent so the user can get their message across to their audience. That's what a goal of a control system is.
Control and automation in AV didn't begin with a grand vision or a Silicon Valley pitch deck. It began with a retired engineer at a drafting table, a problem nobody named yet, and a generation of programmers who had to invent both the language and the art at the same time.
It's a funny story here, because Uncle Richie's always got a story here. And so I do live in Silicon Valley. And so we obviously had the venture capital community, all the investment banking companies. And so in the late 80s, the very first, we wound up being termed the 10-foot display. The first kind of user interface display that came out was a system called Frox. It's like a 35-inch, 250, almost 300-pound glass monitor with an air mouse. And it was the first graphical user interface, and everything came up. It was a pay service. I mean, this thing was literally 40 years ahead of its time. We had one of the first ones. Unfortunately, Frox never saw the light of day past kind of the demo system. And so, the only way you can tell somebody at this point who's almost eligible for Social Security is if they know what I mean when I say the word Frox. So fast forward to, the mid-90s or so. We have a client and he's like, I want something like Back to the Future. And if you remember, the big screens and everything came on, so voice wasn't going to work. And a touch panel wasn't going to work. And a remote wasn't necessarily going to work because it didn't have all of the features. But it was about having a heads-up display on a big screen. So, of course, what do? We have a custom motorized pull-out 35-inch Mitsubishi glass display that weighs 300 pounds. So we have this thing coming out and motoring. And one of the manufacturers we were working with came out with their basically version of their, web page interface, whatever it was. Client had a specific request, though. He didn't want to have to switch back and forth from pages. He wanted inset video. So we worked with the manufacturer and we're like, how are we going to do this? Lo and behold, we built our first one-off PC with a video inset card. Built the graphical user interface and what was a little air mouse. So it was basically a little remote trackball. And sure enough, you'd have the bar off to the side with your system controls, and you'd mouse your way over and you'd click a source, and in would come this beautiful, crystal clear 480p image brought in from a Ferrugia line doubler. No, keep in mind, it was a 480i image, line doubled to a whopping 480p. Sure enough, he's like, yeah, and I just want to be able to click on it and it goes full screen. So we're going, sure. And we did. And we spent months on it. And so finally it comes, and we get the system to work, and kind of in that fit of inspiration, it was like, well, what do you call it? And I'm thinking back to the original Frox. And I went, you know what? We call it Frax. Fragosa's really awesome experiment. And the rest is history. So
some of those programmers are still at it. Some are close to retirement. And the systems they built are running now in rooms all over the world. That's the invisible machine. And that's always been the goal. Thanks for listening to A State of Control. Thank you to our guests, Dan Feldstein, Peter Knapp, Mike Leitensdorfer, and George Tucker.
the network for the AV industry.
What are you listening to?
This
is AV.
This
is AVNation.
This is AVNation.
Hi, this is Jennifer Goodyear
and Erica Carroll
from the Women in AV podcast, where we are encouraged by the incredible stories of women in AV.
Listen in on fun, empowering conversations as we chat with inspiring women, breaking barriers and creating their own path in the industry.
Check out Women in AV on avnation.tv or wherever you get your podcasts.